The winter of 1945 still carried the heavy silence of battles past. Snow covered the broken fields of Bastogne, hiding the memories buried deep beneath. Captain Manuel Ramirez, a soldier far from home, returned not to fight, but to remember. By his side was Eleanor, a young woman searching for a piece of her own story. Together, they crossed the frozen ground to find the people who had once been more than comrades. They had been family. And among them stood Irina Kowalski, a nurse who had faced the worst of the world, yet kept hope alive in her hands. Today, we follow their steps. We listen to the echoes of courage, kindness, and promises made under the darkest skies, because some moments and some bonds are simply too powerful to fade. Welcome to the channel. If you believe these stories should never be forgotten, join us, subscribe now, and turn on the notifications to help keep every memory and every story alive. Without further delay, let's get straight to the point. The sun hung low over the old military camp, casting long golden shadows across the battered tents and muddy paths. Soldiers from America, Britain and France stood in small groups, adjusting their worn uniforms and trading quiet words, as if trying to steady their nerves for what was about to happen. Among them, walking carefully between the makeshift shelters, was Eleanor. She moved with an air of grace, her coat perfectly clean, her steps precise, the kind of presence that didn't quite belong. Among the worn boots and weathered faces, Eleanor was the daughter of a diplomat, raised far from the sounds of gunfire and the heavy silence that follows. And today, her world was about to collide with another very different from her own. As she approached the heart of the camp, a few soldiers paused their conversations, their gazes following her with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. It wasn't just the way she walked or the elegant scarf around her neck. It was the invisible wall that seemed to rise between her world of polished floors and quiet negotiations and theirs, built from sleepless nights and quiet acts of courage. At the center of it all stood Irina Kowalski, the woman they called the Angel of Bastogne. Her uniform was simple, her hands worn by years of caring for the wounded under skies that had long forgotten what peace looked like. Irina wasn't known for speeches or medals. She was known for the way she stayed beside the hurt, for how she carried hope in a place where few dared to believe in it anymore. When Eleanor met Irina's gaze, something raw and real passed between them, a current of unspoken truths. But the weight of that moment was too much for Eleanor, whose life had taught her to cover discomfort with words. And so, with a small, almost careless smile, she let slip a comment sharp enough to slice through the thin air of respect around them. A few soldiers shifted uneasily, pretending not to hear. Irina didn't move. She simply looked at Eleanor with a calmness forged in the hardest days of her life, a silence louder than any words. It wasn't anger, it wasn't pride. It was the quiet understanding of someone who had seen what the cost of survival truly meant. For a moment, Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with something she hadn't expected: shame. Not because someone had scolded her, but because in Irina's steady eyes, she glimpsed a life far beyond her own sheltered world. A life where sacrifice wasn't a story in a book, but a memory carried in every step. That afternoon, the air between them remained heavy, filled with everything that had been said without speaking. Eleanor realized, perhaps for the first time, that there were wounds deeper than any visible mark, and wars that continued long after the fighting ended. Two worlds had met that day, one of diplomacy and polished shoes, and one of mud, endurance, and the quiet bravery of those who gave everything without expecting to be remembered. As the camp slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, Eleanor stayed behind for a long time, watching Irina from a distance, 1,000 questions and regrets filling the space between them. And deep inside, something began to change. A small, painful awakening to the reality that true heroism often wears no medals and speaks no grand words. The cold wind slipped through the torn tents, carrying with it the heavy scent of wet earth and old memories. Beneath a patchwork of worn canvas and flickering lanterns, soldiers and nurses gathered for a rare moment of peace, a small dinner to honor the ties that had survived the storm of war. Plates rattled softly on wooden tables, and rough laughter tried to fill the space between the long silences. For once, there were no orders, no alarms, no hurried footsteps, only the quiet comfort of familiar faces, hands that had carried each other through the darkest nights, and eyes that still remembered too much. At the center of it all sat Eleanor, her presence as delicate and striking as a flame in the cold. She wore her fine coat and polished boots like armor, unaware of how out of place they looked among the patched uniforms and worn medals. As she sipped her drink, her gaze swept over the gathered veterans, the men and women whose lives had been stitched together by hardship and silent bravery. And then, with a soft, careless laugh, Eleanor spoke. Her words weren't cruel in their sound, but they carried a sting, a sharp reminder that not everyone could see the weight others bore. To her, the lines on their faces, the tremble in their hands, the faraway look in their eyes were nothing but signs of age and wear. She didn't understand the price they had paid, the sleepless nights, the promises broken by the cruelty of fate, the small pieces of themselves left behind in places no one else would ever visit. The table fell silent. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. Manuel, sitting beside her, felt his throat tighten with shame. His fingers curled against the rough wood of the table, but no words came. He wanted to stand, to speak, to bridge the vast distance that had opened between Eleanor and the rest of the room, but fear and pride held him still. Across the table, Irina Kowalski watched it all unfold. She didn't speak, she didn't move. But inside her, something fragile shifted and cracked. It wasn't anger that filled her chest. It wasn't wounded pride. It was something far heavier. The quiet, aching realization that not every bond survives the invisible scars that war leaves behind. The warmth of the gathering grew colder with each passing moment. The laughter didn't return. The food tasted of ashes. And in that long, heavy silence, everyone knew something had been lost, something too small to name, but too large to mend. Eleanor, oblivious to the storm she had stirred, went on smiling, her world untouched. But for the others, the evening had changed. No longer a celebration of survival, but a quiet mourning for the things that even victory could not restore. Irina lowered her gaze, her heart carrying yet another burden, the knowledge that true understanding could not be forced, and that some distances once opened could never be crossed again. The night wore on, and the bitter wind outside only seemed to grow stronger. Inside the fragile shelter of the torn tents, the gathering struggled to find its rhythm again, but the weight of Eleanor's careless words still hung heavy in the air. As another round of drinks was passed around, Eleanor, with a laugh a little too loud for the room, reached for her glass. In a clumsy, distracted motion, her hand caught the edge of it, and a dark wave of wine spilled forward, splashing straight onto Irina Kowalski's uniform. Gasps broke the quiet, and for a moment, it felt as if the world itself had frozen. The deep red stain spread across Irina's worn jacket, the same jacket she had carried through blizzards, through the liberation of camps that the world had once turned its eyes away from, through desperate battles where every breath had been a victory. It wasn't just fabric, it was memory. It was honor stitched into every thread. Eleanor covered her mouth, a shallow apology hovering on her lips, but it came too late, and it wasn't enough. Across the room, Colonel Walter Harrison, a broad-shouldered, battle-hardened leader of the 101st, pushed back his chair and rose to his feet. His sharp eyes locked onto Eleanor, not with anger, but with the fierce, steady dignity of a man who knew exactly what Irina's uniform represented. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence that filled the tent was louder than any shout could ever be. "Irina's earned the right to wear that uniform," he said, his voice low but unshakable, "and no spilled wine, no careless words will ever take that away." For a moment, no one moved. No one even breathed. Manuel sat frozen in his chair, his heart pounding against his ribs. Part of him wanted to rise, to stand at Irina's side, to say the things he couldn't find the courage to say before. But another part, the part still chained by doubt, by fear, by the complicated ties that held him to Eleanor, kept him rooted to the spot. Irina looked down at the spreading stain, then up into the faces around her. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply nodded to Colonel Harrison in silent gratitude, straightened her shoulders, and wore the stained jacket with the same quiet pride she had always carried, because real dignity, she knew, wasn't something that could be taken away by clumsy hands or thoughtless tongues. It lived deeper than uniforms. It lived in the choices made when no one was watching, in the battles fought within, and in the simple act of standing tall when the world tried to push you down. As the lanterns flickered and the cold pressed harder against the thin walls of the tent, something unspoken passed between the soldiers that night, a bond of respect reforged in silence and in the unbreakable strength of those who had seen too much and yet chosen to keep going. And Manuel, sitting there with regret burning in his chest, realized that sometimes the most painful wounds were the ones left by the words we didn't say and the stands we didn't take. The cold before dawn was the kind that slipped into your bones and stayed there, no matter how many layers you wore. The tents groaned under the weight of frost, and the camp lay silent, broken only by the occasional crackle of a dying fire. Inside one of the smaller tents, under the dim light of a single lantern, Irina Kowalski moved quietly, packing away the few pieces of a life that could never truly fit into a single bag. Her hands were steady, but slow, as if each item she touched pulled at something deep inside her. Faded letters, worn thin by years of folding and unfolding, each carrying words from souls who had long since vanished. Medals, dulled by time, meant not for glory, but as quiet reminders of battles fought in places few dared to remember. And tucked carefully in the folds of an old scarf, a small cracked photograph. In it, a young Manuel Ramirez smiled up at her, his arm in a sling, his face still full of a hope that even war hadn't yet stolen. Irina paused, her thumb brushing gently over the image. So much had changed. The world outside these tents no longer seemed to remember the promises made when the fires still burned bright and the losses were fresh in everyone's mind. The flap of the tent shifted, and in stepped Sergeant Isabelle Dumont, a young Canadian with sharp eyes and a heart too big for her small frame. She hesitated for a moment, seeing the half-packed bag, the look on Irina's face. "You don't have to go," Isabelle said, her voice low, almost pleading. "You belong here. We need you." Irina smiled, but it was a tired smile, the kind that comes after carrying too much for too long. She reached out and squeezed Isabelle's hand, the gesture full of the warmth that words could not carry. "There are times, child," Irina said gently, "when staying does more harm than leaving. When the heart knows it's time to walk away, before the weight of what others forget becomes too heavy to bear." Isabelle blinked hard, trying to hold back the sting behind her eyes. It wasn't fair. Heroes weren't supposed to pack up and disappear into the cold before anyone noticed they were gone. But war Isabel was learning wasn't about fairness. It was about survival, sometimes of the body, sometimes of the spirit. Irina finished folding the last of her things, wrapping the photograph with particular care. Each item placed into her bag wasn't just a belonging. It was a piece of the past, a shard of a life built not on victories, but on silent moments of bravery no history book would ever fully capture. Outside, the first hints of morning stretched pale and thin across the frozen sky. The camp still slept, unaware that by the time the sun rose, one of its quietest heroes would already be gone. At the entrance to the tent, Isabel stood stiffly, fighting the urge to say more, to ask her to stay one last time. But something in Irina's posture, the quiet dignity, the deep sadness that refused to be pitied, told her that nothing she could say would change what needed to happen. Irina adjusted her scarf, pulled the strap of her bag over one shoulder, and turned to face Isabel one last time. "Take care of them," she said simply, and with a small, almost imperceptible nod, she stepped out into the freezing dark. The snow crunched softly under her boots as she walked away, not hurried, not hesitating. She didn't look back, because Irina knew. Sometimes it's not the battles that break you, it's the slow fading of gratitude, the quiet forgetting of those who once held the line when hope itself seemed lost. And in that forgotten silence, it takes more courage to walk away than it ever did to stay. The first light of morning barely touched the edge of the camp when Manuel Ramirez stepped into Irina's tent. The cold air bit at his face, but he hardly noticed it. His eyes fell instantly on the small, worn bag sitting neatly by the entrance. A simple thing, yet it struck him harder than any wound he had ever taken in battle. Inside that bag was more than clothing or medals. It was a lifetime of service, of quiet sacrifices made without asking for anything in return. And here it was, packed away, ready to leave without fanfare, without farewell. Manuel stood there for a long moment, the heavy silence wrapping around him like a second skin. The realization hit him with full force. He had been fighting the wrong battles. He had let fear, comfort, and misplaced loyalty tie his hands while the true heroes quietly slipped away. He clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of shame settle deep in his chest. No more. Without thinking twice, Manuel turned on his heel and strode through the slumbering camp, his boots crunching over the frozen ground with a steady, unbreakable rhythm. Each step was a decision. Each breath was a promise to himself, one he should have made long ago. He found Eleanor exactly where he knew she would be, seated in the officers' quarters, her fine coat wrapped around her shoulders, her face calm, untouched by the cold reality that surrounded them. The room quieted as Manuel entered. Conversations paused, eyes turned. Even Eleanor straightened a little in her chair, sensing something had shifted. Manuel didn't hesitate. He walked directly to her, his face set, his voice steady and clear for all to hear. "You will leave this camp immediately," he said. The words cut through the air sharper than any blade. Eleanor blinked, stunned, her mouth opening as if to argue, but Manuel's gaze left no room for questions. Around the room, the other officers exchanged quick, uncertain glances, but no one dared to interrupt. They understood. Some things, after all, went deeper than orders or rank. This wasn't about anger, it wasn't about pride. It was about something much older, much stronger. The loyalty born in the trenches, under skies filled with fire. The loyalty owed not by bloodlines or names, but by the simple, sacred act of standing by those who carried you when you couldn't walk yourself. Years ago, when the world had seemed to fall apart around him, when hope had felt like a word meant for other men, it was Irina Kowalski who had been there. With steady hands and a heart too stubborn to give up, she had pulled him back from the brink, never asking for anything in return. Now it was his turn to stand for her. Eleanor rose to her feet, her face pale with disbelief, but she said nothing. Deep down, perhaps, even she knew the truth of it, that her presence here had become a shadow over something sacred. Manuel watched as she gathered her things with trembling hands, her pride offering little protection against the cold stares of the room. She left without ceremony, her boots crunching across the frozen ground, swallowed up by the dawn mist. Manuel remained standing in the center of the room for a moment longer, feeling the strange, hollow ache of decisions made too late, but made nonetheless. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a perfect man. But today, at least, he had chosen rightly. Not for medals, not for appearances, for the silent, unseen acts of loyalty that stitched broken souls back together in the darkest nights of war. As he stepped outside, the first full rays of the sun broke over the horizon, painting the camp in a soft golden light. A new beginning, fragile and hard-earned. And somewhere not far away, Irina Kowalski prepared to leave, unaware that the man she had once saved had, in his own way, finally saved a piece of himself. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting a soft golden light over the small garden hidden at the edge of the camp. It wasn't much. A few rows of wooden markers, wildflowers scattered by the wind, and a simple stone at the center where no grand statues stood. But to those who had survived, this place was sacred. It was a garden of memories, planted not to mourn the past, but to honor it. Manuel Ramirez walked slowly through the worn path, the crunch of gravel under his boots the only sound in the still evening air. In his hand, he held a small box, worn smooth by the countless times he had turned it over in his palm. Wondering if he had the right to give it, he found Irina standing near the center of the garden, her figure still and strong against the fading light. She looked out across the simple memorials, her hands folded loosely in front of her, the lines of her face softening in the glow of the setting sun. For a moment, Manuel simply watched her, overwhelmed by everything she had endured, and everything she had given without ever asking for anything in return. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he crossed the last few feet between them, and before he could lose his courage, Manuel dropped to one knee before her. Irina turned, startled, her eyes wide with confusion. But Manuel only smiled, a small, tired smile full of things he couldn't quite put into words. Without speaking, he opened the box. Inside, resting on a cushion of dark velvet, was a simple silver locket. Its surface was scratched, its shine dulled by time. But when Irina opened it, she gasped softly. Inside were tiny photographs, carefully placed, carefully protected. The faces of the soldiers she had helped carry through the worst days of the war. Young faces, tired faces, hopeful faces. A living memory of the lives she had touched, preserved forever in a locket no larger than a coin. Tears welled in Irina's eyes, blurring the photographs until they became a sea of light and shadow. She pressed the locket to her chest, her hands trembling not from cold, but from the sheer, overwhelming wave of emotions she had long kept locked away. But Manuel wasn't finished. From inside his jacket, he pulled a second envelope, thick, heavy. He placed it gently into her hand. Irina looked at him, confused. But Manuel only nodded. With shaking fingers, she opened it. Inside were official documents, deeds, signatures, stamps of approval. The gift was simple, yet priceless. A small house in the countryside of France, far from the ruins of old battlefields, far from the echo of gunfire. A place where she could live. Not as a soldier, not as a memory, but as herself, free, safe. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The garden around them swayed softly in the evening breeze, the wildflowers bending as if bowing their heads in quiet respect. And then, for the first time in many, many years, Irina let the tears fall. They slid down her cheeks, carrying with them the weight of countless nights spent holding the hands of the wounded, the faces of friends left behind, the quiet, aching sorrow that no victory parade could ever erase. She cried not from sadness, but from something deeper, from gratitude, from release, from the simple, beautiful recognition that at long last, someone had seen her, truly seen her. Manuel rose to his feet and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "No medal, no speech, no monument could ever repay what you've done," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But maybe this is a start." Irina nodded, unable to speak. The past and the present blurred together in that moment. The battles, the sacrifices, the friendships, the grief, all woven into a single thread of memory and hope. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. In the heart of the garden, surrounded by the silent witnesses of their shared history, Irina Kowalski held her locket close and closed her eyes, feeling, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the healing touch of peace. And somewhere in the distance, the world continued to turn. But here, in this small corner of memory and love, time stood still just a little longer. The sky hung low and heavy with thick grey clouds, as if the heavens themselves bore witness to the quiet gathering taking place below. In the center of the battered camp, where once only hurried footsteps and hurried orders had echoed, a small courtyard had been cleared. Nothing grand, nothing decorated. Just a bare space, surrounded by torn flags and tired tents, where memories spoke louder than any words. Veterans from every corner of the struggle stood shoulder to shoulder, Americans in jackets worn thin by endless marches. Poles with eyes that had seen the worst of humanity and still found reason to fight. Brits whose boots were as battered as their pride was unbroken. Frenchmen who carried the weight of home on their backs through years of hardship. No orders had been given to assemble, no speeches had been prepared. They had come because they needed to, because some debts could never be spoken aloud, only honored in silence. At the heart of the courtyard stood Irina Kowalski. She wore her simple uniform, the old stain of wine still visible across the fabric, refusing to wash away what it now symbolized, the battle she had fought long after the cannons had gone quiet. Her hands rested calmly at her sides. Her face, framed by the soft silver of her hair, held no pride, no expectation, only humility. Manuel stood a few steps behind her, his chest tight with the kind of emotion that left no room for words. One by one, the soldiers approached. There were no medals pinned today, no grand banners unfurled. Instead, each man and woman simply stepped forward, offering small tokens, each one carrying the weight of a lifetime. An American sergeant, his hand trembling slightly, placed a folded patch from his old unit at Irina's feet. The same patch he had worn the night Irina had pulled him from the wreckage of a shattered convoy. A Polish officer, his cap tucked respectfully under his arm, offered a simple rosary, the beads worn smooth by years of prayer whispered on battlefields. A British medic placed a faded handkerchief, stitched with the initials of soldiers Irina had refused to leave behind, even when the world around them crumbled. A French radio operator, who had once crawled through burning ruins, guided only by her voice calling out in the dark, placed a single, weathered button from his first uniform. Each offering was different. Each one told a story. Each one said what words never could. You were there, you mattered, you saved us. The air grew heavier with each step, with each silent tribute. No music played, Only the soft shuffle of boots on frozen ground and the crackle of the cold wind moving through the flags above. Irina stood still, her eyes glistening, but no tears fell. This wasn't a farewell born of sadness. It was a celebration of something far rarer, the kind of courage that didn't seek medals, the kind of strength that didn't need songs or parades. It lived in the quiet moments, in the hands held through fear, in the whispered promises to keep fighting, in the faces that still smiled because someone like her had stood beside them when it mattered most. After the last tribute was placed at her feet, the courtyard fell into a silence so deep it seemed to stretch beyond the camp, beyond the war, beyond the years. And then, as if moved by the same unspoken thought, every veteran present raised a hand. 2 fingers pressed against their temple, a salute older than nations, older than the battles that had brought them together. It wasn't a salute of rank, it was a salute of brothers and sisters in arms, to a guardian who had walked through fire with them and never asked for thanks. Irina returned the gesture, her hand trembling just slightly as she lifted it. A small smile touched her lips, not of victory, but of peace. The sky above remained heavy, but somehow in that battered courtyard there was a light stronger than the sun, a light born not from glory, but from gratitude. And though the years would march on, and the world would build new monuments to newer battles, those who stood there that day would carry the memory of Irina Kowalski, not as a story told in books, but as a part of themselves stitched deep into the fabric of who they had become. A quiet hero, an unbreakable spirit, and a reminder that some acts of courage are so pure they never truly fade. Long after the last shots had faded and the banners of victory had been folded away, a different kind of memory remained, one that no medal could capture and no official history book could truly honor. It was the memory of Irina Kowalski, not as a soldier charging into battle, not as a figure marching in grand parades, but as something far rarer, a guardian of what made them human when the world tried its hardest to tear it all apart. In the freezing nights, when the fires burned low and the wind howled through shattered towns, it wasn't strength of arms that kept them standing. It was people like Irina, steady, tireless, moving from one broken soul to the next with hands that healed instead of harmed, with words that soothed even when hope was in short supply. She was a living proof that real heroism wasn't just about carrying a rifle or storming enemy lines. Sometimes it was about sitting beside a trembling young man, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders and reminding him, with nothing more than a touch, a look, or a whisper, that he was not alone. While others fought battles with bullets, Irina fought a different kind of war, a war against despair, a war against the slow, creeping darkness that threatened to swallow even the bravest hearts. In the hunger, she found ways to share what little there was. In the cold, she found ways to build warmth from nothing more than a worn coat and a willing spirit. And in the face of so much loss, she refused to let the final light of humanity flicker out. Many who passed through the camps and field hospitals never remembered the exact faces of the officers who gave them orders. But they remembered Irina. They remembered the way her presence made the nightmare seem, if only for a moment, a little less endless. They remembered the way her hand, calloused and steady, never wavered when it closed around theirs. In her, they saw the kind of strength that no battlefield could conquer. It wasn't loud, it wasn't celebrated in songs. It was the quiet, stubborn, relentless strength of compassion, the belief that even in a world shattered beyond recognition, kindness still mattered. Decades later, when old soldiers sat around fires in different countries telling stories that blurred with time, her name would surface like a shared secret, not with grand declarations, but with a quiet nod, a soft smile, a faraway look in the eyes. They would remember the woman who showed them that bravery wasn't just about facing enemy fire. It was about facing fear, loss, and sorrow without letting it harden your soul. Irina Kowalski had never sought recognition. She had never asked for statues or parades. But in the hearts of those she had touched, she had built something stronger than monuments. She had built bridges between the past and the future, fragile, precious bridges made of compassion, of resilience, of hope. In the end, war had stripped away many things, cities, dreams, even entire generations. But it had not destroyed Irina's light. It had not destroyed the simple, profound truth she carried with her through every frozen field and broken village, that even in the darkest times, it is the small acts of love that keep the world turning. And because of people like her, the memory of what it means to be human, to care, to endure, to believe, survived, even when the world tried its hardest to forget. As the last tents were closed and the final rifles were placed carefully away, Irina Kowalski walked beyond the edge of the camp, her figure slowly fading into the misty morning light. She carried no medals, no grand farewell speeches, only memories stitched into her heart like the quiet scars she bore with dignity. But even as she disappeared into the horizon, she was never truly gone. In every veteran who returned home with unseen wounds and quiet strength, she remained. In every scar hidden behind a tired smile, every dream whispered under broken skies, her spirit lived on. She became a silent guardian of those who had once dared to dream of peace, even when the world around them seemed determined to tear it apart. Irina's legacy was never about the battles she fought or the uniforms she wore. It was about the lives she touched, the moments she stitched back together when everything else had fallen apart. She showed that true strength wasn't found in shouts or in medals polished for parades. It was found in the small acts of compassion that kept humanity alive, even in the darkest times. And that is how she would be remembered. Not with grand monuments, but in the quiet stories passed from one generation to the next. Stories told around campfires, in small gatherings, in the soft moments when old soldiers close their eyes and smile, remembering not the battles, but the hands that pulled them through. Irina became more than a nurse, more than a veteran. She became a living bridge between past and future, a reminder that courage is not just surviving the fight, but holding on to kindness when everything else falls away. Because in the end, it is not the noise of history that defines us. It is the quiet, steady heartbeat of those who never let hope die. Did you already know this story? What would you have done in Manuel's place? What other stories about soldiers and veterans do you think should be shared? Tell us in the comments. Your voice keeps these memories alive. If this story moved you, don't let it be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this one. Stories of courage, sacrifice, and the light that refuses to fade, no matter how long the night. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until the next story, stay strong, stay kind, and never forget the ones who kept hope alive when the world needed it most.